Christopher Nolan. I don't know if he's a household name, but Christopher Nolan is certainly a name that a lot of people recognize. Like, compare the name Christopher Nolan to Boots Riley. When a Christopher Nolan movie comes out, it's an event. Granted, Nolan's been around a lot longer than Boots Riley, but there is this interesting conversation that goes on around Nolan of whether he is a conservative. I think it's an interesting conversation because I'm always interested in conservatism as a perspective on the world, because it's a perspective on the world that I grew up with and largely held for a majority of my life. And now I like to look at it from a more analytical perspective as to how it comes about, why it comes about, in the hopes that we could diminish its influence. So let's get into Nolan first. I'm gonna just throw it out there that his two biggest movies right now are gonna be The Dark Knight and Oppenheimer. The Dark Knight is as one article described it, clearly post 9/11 Batman. The Joker in The Dark Knight is more of a terrorist than we've, I think, ever seen him depicted up to that point. We knew that the Joker was sadistic, but I think it was The Dark Knight that solidified just how close to a sort of homegrown terrorism, a sort of domestic terrorism that the Joker is. Notably, the Joker in The Dark Knight is not cute, not circusy in any way. I wouldn't even call the quote-unquote magic trick scene with him cute. It's very unsettling in a way that the Joker gas or chemicals in Batman 1989 Batman movie that killed people but made them eternally smile. There was something cute in that, and that's not the Joker that we get or see in The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight is, maybe alongside The Dark Knight Rises, is probably the most conservatively coded of Nolan's movies. So you have people saying things like The Dark Knight is about fighting against terrorism and using whatever means necessary. It has, specifically The Dark Knight, it has Batman using surveillance technology to find the Joker, which it recognizes as corrupt but still does. It has this idea of lying to the public in a noble way. I'll link to a Reddit discussion, which I think clarifies this more. The noble lie as a way to maintain societal order. So at the end of The Dark Knight, Batman takes on the crimes of Harvey Dent so that Harvey Dent can be portrayed as this good governmental figure, and they can use specifically his death as a way to implement massive crime sweeps, which then in The Dark Knight Rises we see turn out not so great.
The Dent Act. Based on a lie.
And then, of course, in The Dark Knight Rises, there's the argument that some people have that it is a response to Occupy Wall Street. The populist leftist nature of Bane is seen as akin to the Occupy Wall Street movement.
The people.
And I think that's fair. I also think that the superhero genre in general is going to naturally lean towards some sense of conservatism. I think, and I say this without having read any Nietzsche, I just listened to a couple podcasts on him, but I think that the superhero is, in our modern conception, is very much a continuation of, Jade, don't you mess that up. Okay, but don't move it. Okay, you can sit. The superhero is very much a continuation of Nietzsche's concept, the Übermensch, the evolution of man. Superman as one of the first and largest superheroes is very much that symbolization of man evolved. So in this sense, superheroes are not just human. They're almost more than human. They're almost godlike in that way. And therefore they appeal to a lot of, to all of us, because like they hold these values and this disposition that we want to have towards or values and dispositions. Jade, they can't see me. Thank you. But don't make that okay. They hold these values and dispositions that we aspire to, but again, that also separates them from us, and often in a way that makes them better than us. So it's not like controversial, I think, to say that like around the corner from like superhero culture and superhero fanaticism is fascism. Specifically with Batman, we have a rich white male fighting for the safety of his city. So we have this side of Nolan, this Batman side of Nolan, which I would say shows up more than just in Batman, but Christopher Nolan and his movies are more than just Batman. He's not James Gunn. He didn't make the Batman movies because he is just enthusiastic about Batman. He made the movies to explore how he relates to Batman, which I'll probably have to say many times, but that doesn't make it better or worse. That just is, I think, a characteristic of the Nolan Batman movies. So now let's look at the other, what I'm calling most popular movie of Nolan's, which is...
And now I have become death.
So in Oppenheimer, we get this sense of communist sympathies. On a surface level, I feel like some people point to that as like, oh, he's actually not a conservative, which I think is just as shallow of an argument, honestly, as the argument that he is a conservative. I don't really care or think that it's important whether Christopher Nolan is or is not a conservative. I think the more interesting question is how Christopher Nolan's movies are received within the wider public. No matter what Nolan intends, he is, now at least, pop culture. His movies are an event. As an example, I was just trying to find a showing of The Odyssey. I looked 2 weeks out and there wasn't any, like all the seats were reserved. Like literally all the seats were reserved. You can't deny that Christopher Nolan is possibly the premier blockbuster movie maker of today. And there are several elements that make him that. I'll link a good article that kind of ties in the evidence that I'm pulling this from. Some of the points are studio executives are really happy with him because he can stay within a budget. He has this kind of austere way of directing his sets that maintains a certain level of order. Obviously, he's pulling in a lot of money with it, but he's like the poster boy for a good worker bee. And his movies aren't, I wouldn't say necessarily the most critically acclaimed. I guess Oppenheimer, I think I read, got like Best Picture. His movies are not winning Best Picture every time in the way that other less blockbuster focused directors could. And again, that's not a knock on Christopher Nolan. I like his movies. That's just to say this is what he exists as. I think, which I think could be said of any successful filmmaker, that Nolan's aesthetic was just kind of a luck of the draw. He, in his early work, and still to this day, I think, like, has this reactionary take towards fantastic, campish style of movies. He wants to make his movies realistic. He wants it to make it grounded. That was the big thing about the Dark Knight trilogy, is that it was so grounded compared to the Schumacher and even the Burton movies. And okay, like that's fair, but also like, does groundedness, does seriousness, especially a self-imposed seriousness, make something more artistically valid? Obviously the answer is no. That just happened to be what I guess audiences and were looking for in movies of the time that Nolan is coming up in his directorial fame. And I think that you could parallel like this return to seriousness with a little bit of the conservatism of the past 10 years. Like there's this sense in which, okay, no nonsense, like we're going in, we're draining the swamp, like we're doing things the right way as it should have been done from the beginning. And I think there is a parallel between that tone of conservative politics and the tone of Christopher Nolan's movies. Certainly in both, there is an elevation of sacrifice in order for one to be successful or to live a good life. You have to be willing to dispel your desires and to withhold them so that you can gain the greater reward that is whatever that may be. Making more money, having a more excellent physique, yada yada. I talked about The Noble Lie with The Dark Knight. That also fits with like this seriousness. And it's funny to say seriousness of conservative politics of the past 10 years, because I feel like Trump is very much not a serious person in a certain sense, but he also kind of is. Like, maybe serious is the wrong word, but like this no nonsense. Like, okay, we're getting down to business. Like we can have fun, but we're doing it the right way. And that is something I think that could be attributed to Nolan, especially his style of movie making, and more so like this more shallow critical appreciation of his movies is that they are no nonsense. They get down to business. They still have quips.
And yes, Mr. Wayne, it does come in black.
But, you know, we're using real science. We're using real effects. We're making real Batmobiles. We're doing real wormhole physics. We're exploring the psychology of the human mind. These down to earth, quote unquote, topics that make a Nolan movie a Nolan movie. And I think the point above all that would connect the Nolan movies with modern conservative politics more than anything is the fact that like 95%, in fact, only one of his movies doesn't have a white male lead, and specifically a white male lead that is skilled and therefore somewhat arrogant, but also brooding and like fighting against many external struggles. If that like doesn't kind of capture the way that I think a lot of conservatives, especially white male conservatives, see themselves nowadays, then I don't know what would. Nolan is about as close as you can get to being a conservative that the public will take seriously. His apolitical nature, which I don't think he does in just for widespread appeal. I think he is not interested in politics generally. I think he is interested in telling stories, which isn't to say that the stories themselves can't be political, but like if we were to like measure the conservatism in it, I would say they lean more towards conservatism than most popular movies of the day. Christopher Nolan's kind of like the Nietzsche of modern film, which is a big statement and also probably a wrong statement. And also, if this were to spread throughout the internet somehow, I'm sure I would get a lot of flack for it, but I'm going to say it anyways because it vibes with my understanding of Nietzsche and my understanding of Nolan. And I'm interested to hear what critiques there are about it. Yeah, so it really doesn't matter, as I was saying, if Nolan is a conservative. Whether he is or isn't, he's not approaching his films that way. And also, there's a sense in which, from at least from a mass culture sense, that like political topics aren't in vogue. It's gauche to be political. I Love Boosters is clearly a very political movie.
We're trying to get together to get longer breaks and a third more of our money.
I Love Boosters is just not as popular as The Odyssey. It's not going to make as much money as The Odyssey. It's not going to have as many ticket sales as The Odyssey. And that's not to say that The Odyssey is better than I Love Boosters or that I Love Boosters is better than The Odyssey. But this mass appeal that Nolan has garnered does bring with it a certain level of social acceptance. And I think I already made this point, but I'm going to say it again. There is a fact about Nolan movies that we can make, which is that in the US, stories about strong white men struggling against nature, against time, space, gods, or other men even, still garner wide appeal. This kind of diffuses the idea of white replacement. I'm going to assume that most people watching this have at least some familiarity with the white replacement theory. There's a whole like history to it. If you aren't familiar with it, that's probably good for your own mental health, but nevertheless, here I am talking about it. So there was this 2012 book written by a French guy called Le Grand Remplacement. And I forget what his credentials are. His perception of how French demography was changing. I understand it to use stronger language than just that, and basically to kind of invoke this fear of an Islamist replacement of France, which is actually something that I've heard before. Here I am finding out where it came from. For our discussion today here, we could consider the white replacement theory as best described by Tucker Carlson and his pitting of legacy Americans against faraway countries, or against people from faraway countries. There's this sense in which, especially when the faraway countries are the Middle East, and people from the Middle East and Arab peoples, it gets like proposed as like, these are people fighting against democracy, and it's an attack on the rationalistic nature of the Enlightenment. I think what they're really trying to express is their own reaction to the evolution of democracy, which is that as you allow more people to have their voices heard, you hear opinions different from your own. And in their response to this spread of democracy, they seemingly want to ask the question of, how can I stop this multiculturalism that I'm seeing around me? And in its worst form, the white replacement theory is basically a conspiracy theory that this is all deliberate, it's all intentional, it's all planned. I don't think that most of the people who would sympathize with this theory, or at least like give credence to this, I would hope that they wouldn't believe in the conspiratorial nature of it, like that this is a plan or an attack by the government to like specifically replace white people with foreign people who are more obedient and more willing to associate with the quote unquote like liberal cause. I think that's somewhat of a fringe component, but I do think that like this idea that white people and that white culture is being replaced is something that a lot of white people, even if they're not outwardly expressive about it, do sympathize with. And there are four things that I think that this comes from. The first is a distrust of the government. Again, whether they directly believe that like the government is facilitating this, like they're wary, even if indirectly, how the government's stance on immigration could affect their own communities and their own, I guess they're concerned about like the future of America becoming more Latino or Islamic, which like, one, great for America in the future, but like two, I guess they see it as a threat to their direct progeny. They think that eventually America's going to turn into an Islamic state. So that's point one. Point two of like where this sentiment comes from in sympathizers of the white replacement theory is as a response to globalization. So like they're seeing globalization, which I would argue is largely a product of industrialization, which is largely a product of capitalism. And so in a way, like they're responding to capitalism while still supporting it mostly, and saying like, I'm seeing this consumerism and materialism and multiculturalism that's like associated with the globalization of society, and like all the while like my culture, my beliefs are being attacked. In this sense, it is a response to that globalization that they see happening. Number three, whether logically consistent or not, I do think that these people generally believe that the Nazis are bad. I also think that they believe people of Islam are the Nazis. And then finally, I think that there is a large portion of this that comes down to the inherent militarism of countries. So like basically an us versus them ideology. If I don't proliferate my culture and way of life, then other people will come in and subsume it, which I think is especially interesting since white people were like the originators of this idea. But nonetheless, in all this, I guess one could ask the question, what does it mean to be white, or what is white culture? And the ultimate point of me bringing up Nolan and all this is that Christopher Nolan is white culture. He is the monoculture. No matter how much he despises being a popular media event, like that is what his movies are. And also they are the stories of strong white men struggling against forces greater than themselves. If that is not white culture, I don't know what is. In this sense, we could also like start to explore part of the point of white culture is it's like grappling with its disdain for being white. We, whether conservative or progressive, white people tend to grapple with their own disdain for being white, with like this recognition that white culture has subsumed a lot of other cultures. And therefore, in a lot of ways that Nolan protagonists are depicted, there's no like victory for a Nolan protagonist without there being great sacrifice. If someone were to ask what is white culture, I would tell them watch a Christopher Nolan movie. And I'll end on this because I myself am a white male. Christopher Nolan protagonists, as described in this one article, are obsessives with a taste for the theatrical, which, again, I honestly couldn't think of a better way to describe myself.